Please be seated. You know the Sundays that Dan isn't here? I feel a bit like that Bugs Bunny cartoon where he's the one-man baseball team. Right field, Bugs Bunny. Shortstop, Bugs Bunny. When he's the pitcher and catcher is the best. Because there he is, about to wind up, and then he throws the ball and then runs behind. It's the old Pepper, here we go. Sorry. Little flashes from my psyche, from my childhood. The afternoons, way too many afternoons spent with Bugs and his buddies. Invite you to turn to page 916 in your Pew Bible. If you brought your own Bible, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6 in the New Testament. And some of you may open your Bibles and look to see what story it is and go, oh, this one again. Because this is one of the most notoriously famous stories in all of the Gospels. And there's a reason it's one of the most famous, though. It's because it's one of the most powerful, and it's spoken to people over generations and centuries. Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them. And they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. And as Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd. And he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But Jesus answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And Jesus said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. And so they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them as well. And all ate and were filled. They took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men, besides the women and children. May God bless this reading of his word to our lives. Let's pause for a moment to pray. Gracious God, we do ask now that you be our teacher by your Spirit. Open our eyes, our ears, our hearts, our minds, all of our senses to receive what you have for us in this time. May we experience you. May we be encouraged and challenged. And may the words of my mouth and the dreams and thoughts and meditations of our hearts be pleasing to you. For Lord, you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So the feeding of the 5,000, same old, same old. 5 loaves, 2 fish. Voila, magic. A group of over 5,000 people were fed. Miracle. You can all go to lunch now, if you'd like. What will you have for lunch after hearing this story? There's something to see here. And there's miracles, I think, on different levels. On that one level that we're very familiar with, we see what looks to be a miraculous occurrence. Of course, before they got there, Jesus had sent out his disciples to go and do some of what he was doing. And they came back and reported, and they were so excited, and they were also exhausted. as was Jesus. And so he said, let's go off to a deserted place. Let's get some time away before we face the next crowd of people. And so they got into a boat on the Sea of Galilee, which is really like a glorified lake. And we're heading across one of the ends of the lake to a deserted place. But as they were getting on the boat, some people recognized them. You see, they were kind of becoming celebrities, if you will, and people were getting to know them better and better. And so can you imagine a crowd, almost like the paparazzi, running around the side of the lake while Jesus and the disciples are floating to the other side? And they're running around to the other side, and sure enough, when they get to the deserted place, it's not deserted anymore. There's a huge crowd of people wanting to see them, wanting to hear Jesus. If I were in that boat, I would have turned it around and gone back to the other side. But Jesus doesn't. What does it say? It says he looks and he had compassion on the people, which literally means to suffer with the people. He saw that they were empty. He saw that they were looking for something in life. They needed something. And he had compassion on them. And so he got off the boat, tired, hungry, and started teaching them. And this went on for quite some time. And to the point where it was late in the day, the disciples were already hungry. And they could sense that the people there were hungry. And so they came to Jesus and said, hey, think you can knock it off for a little while so we can get something to eat? Tell the people to go to the nearby village. They can go get their fill, and then, we can have some more time together. And Jesus, as he usually does, turns the question on its ear, and he says, no, you give them something to eat. And they start patting their robes, I guess, and wondering what he means. And they actually respond kind of like a typical church committee does. You want us to go and buy them all food? We can't afford that. That's not in the budget. What do you mean? And Jesus says, why don't we start with what we have instead of what we think we need to go get? Go ask around, see if anyone has any food. And they do. And in the Gospel of John's version of this story, there's one boy who comes to the fore who has 5 little loaves of bread, 2 fish, and offers them. Says, well, this is what I've got. And Jesus takes that measly amount of food and he blesses it and gives thanks, and he starts breaking it apart and giving it to the disciples to go disperse to these groups of people. And what do we read? Everyone had their fill. No one was left hungry. They bring back 12 baskets full of food, which I take to mean, oh good, the disciples can eat too. And it's pronounced miracle. There's another way to read this story too that I think is equally miraculous. The same things happen. They're wondering where the food's going to come from. The boy stands up among everyone else and offers this measly amount of food. Jesus blesses it and breaks it and distributes it around to these groups. But what if, as those plates were being passed with that very small amount of food, some people were passing it by, some people were taking a little bit of food, other people were reaching into their pockets and putting food that they actually had already onto those plates that they meant for themselves. If I'm going to go hear this guy speak, I better bring something to eat. I mean, I hear he goes on for hours and hours. And when the plates come back and there's all this food left over, what if the miracle was that the people actually stopped thinking about only themselves and started thinking about the welfare of the rest of the crowd? I mean, really, as you look at human history, that would be a miracle in and of itself. For self-interest to be set aside in order to see the need of others, and for everyone to get their fill, what they need. Miracle. Either way you look at it, very possibly both things were at work at once. It's miraculous. And it's a reminder that ultimately God is the provider. And that ultimately that provision is meant for everyone. Not just for those who are able to maybe earn more of it than others. For those who, for one reason or another in life, have been blessed with more resources than someone else. Part of the question that this story begs for me is, if God is truly the provider of all good gifts, then what's really mine? Is anything really, at its heart, mine? Even the income that I make from serving in my vocation comes from gifts and talents and abilities that I didn't create myself. And those resources have come from people who have recognized that at least some of their resources aren't their own and are willing to give to the greater common good. That's a hard question for us in our culture, because so much of what we tend to focus on is what is mine and what is yours. And what can I earn? And what can I even earn to the point where I can set some aside as a safety net, as a security blanket? And we read not only in this story, but in other stories about the economy of God. And the only times that a security blanket tends to be mentioned are in stories like the rich young fool that Jesus tells later in the gospel, where the person has a bumper crop and stores it all up and builds bigger barns so that he can keep all of the crops, retires early, eats and drinks, and is warm and well fed. And God comes to that man and says, "You fool." Modern translation, you can't take any of it with you. And you're not supposed to. What does it mean for God to be our provider? In the truest, deepest, most foundational and fundamental sense. There's a story that I've told once before here. I'm going to tell it again because it's just great. And it involves a man named Tony Campolo, who is a sociologist and professor and speaker and author for many years, based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And Campolo had come back from a series of speaking engagements, and he flew back to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia, and one of his assistants picked him up. And he was tired. He was ready to just go home and catch up on his sleep. And this assistant said, "Campolo, I don't know if you realize, but you've got a speaking engagement in about an hour and a half." And he looked at his assistant and said, "And how did that get on my schedule?" But he realized a commitment's already been made. It was for a group of about 250 women at a suburban church outside of Philadelphia who were waiting for him to arrive and to speak to them. And in the words of Jesus, he had compassion on them and said, "Okay, I'll go and speak to this group of women." And he gets there, beautiful historic sanctuary in a fairly wealthy suburb. He walks in. He's greeted by the head of the women's ministries there, who has him take a seat near the front. And before he gets up to speak, she pulls out a letter that she received just that week. And the letter was from a missionary partner who they support in Haiti. And this person is doing a medical mission, and they're helping hundreds upon hundreds of people. And they write a letter saying, "We've run out of space. There are more people here than we can treat in our facility. And we want to be able to treat this whole community. What we need is some money to be able to build on an additional wing to our medical center so that we can handle that overflow of people and be able to treat them all. We need about $5,000 to do that." And the woman folds up the letter, and then she says, Reverend Campolo, will you come to the front here and lead us in a prayer? And would you pray that God would provide for our dear missionary brothers and sisters in Haiti? And now, mind you, Campolo was pretty punchy at this point because he was really tired. And he walks up there, and he looks right at her and at the women, and he says, "No, I'm not going to pray. But here's what I am going to do." And he pulls out his wallet, and he pulls out everything he has, and he says, "This was a good day to do this because I only had $3 in my wallet." Placed it on the podium, and he said, "That's all I got with me. $3. What about you?" And the woman comes back up to the front, and she says, "Well, ladies, I think we've all gotten the point of Reverend Campolo's message." And he looks at her and he goes, "You haven't gotten my point at all, lady. My $3 are on the podium. Where are yours?" And this sort of murmur goes over the crowd, like, what on earth is going on here? And after a few moments, he says, "I'm going to invite each of you to open your purses, to open your wallets, and whatever is in there, I want you to come down to this front table and put it on the table." And they all kind of stare at him for a moment, and he looks over here and he goes, I'm not kidding. Lady, you're first. Come on." And one by one, these 250 women came up, opened their wallets, whatever they had on them, they put it on the table. He said it took over a half an hour to collect and count the offering. Didn't leave him any time to talk. But at that point, he said they probably didn't want to hear from him anyway. And when they totaled up the amount that had been given, that was right there in that room, it was over $7,000. And Campolo gets up to the front again and he says, "What are we doing? Praying that God would miraculously provide when God has provided more than enough resources for these missionaries' needs right here in the sanctuary." God is our provider. And if we get anything from this experience in the life of Jesus and his ministry, I wonder if it's this. God is our provider means that God has already provided what the world needs. And if God has already provided what all 6.5 billion of us on this planet need to be able to live, then why is it that such a high percentage of us don't have what we need to live? Why is it that others of us are dying from treatable diseases? Why is it that it seems like not only in our own country, but in other countries, ones who have are distancing themselves more from the ones who have not? I'm not suggesting that the answer to this is simply to go worldwide to everyone's bank account and just level them out so everyone has the same. It's not the point. I wonder if the point is that each of us, in one way or another, have been given resources of some kind. All that boy had were 5 little loaves of bread and 2 fish. He wasn't thinking about being part of a miracle. He just wanted dinner and was willing to give so that others, including himself, could receive. A friend of mine recommended a book to me that just came in the mail yesterday, and I've just started flipping through it, but it's a fascinating premise. It's one of these coffee table books, and it's called Material World, A Global Family Portrait. And Peter Menzel is a photojournalist, and what he did over a series of many years was he went around to dozens and dozens of countries around the world, including our own, and approached families who were living at the median income for that country's economy. They weren't at all the ones at the top end of the scale. They weren't the ones at the absolute bottom of the scale. The median income worldwide. And what he asked them to do, he befriended them and got to know them and hear their stories a bit. And then he asked them one day to take all of the possessions that they have in their house, all of their material things, and bring them outside of the house and set them up in front of the house. And after they had done that, however long that took, then he would take a family portrait with the family standing in front, the possessions behind them, and the house behind the possessions. It's startling to see the differences from country to country. Not just Americans, but other nations that are similarly economically viable and abundant and prosperous, compared with countries that have far less. And you get to read some of the stories, but just seeing those pictures speaks volumes. Speaks volumes to me about what do we really treasure in our lives? What do we think is absolutely, quote-unquote, essential? And what people in other cultures tend to view as essential. And I think about these resources, and I think about how Jesus honored that one boy who was willing in that moment to give whatever he had on him for the benefit of others. I wonder if that's the miracle that God invites each of us to be a part of in whatever way we can. If this is truly what it means to be a person of trust and faith, to look at whatever we do have in our lives, and not just physical material resources, but our relationships, our gifts and talents and abilities, and to take a really close look and to ask the question, how am I being called to be a part of this miracle that God wants to do in the world? Even if it's giving a little of myself here, a little of my resources there, a little of my time to someone who needs it. Miracles so often come from the simplest and smallest stuff in life. I guess the question it leaves me with is, what is my treasure? What do I value most in life? Jesus goes on to say that wherever your treasure is, there your heart is also. If I look at my schedule, if I look at my bank account, if I look at my home, I look at my family, I look at my job, and I look at the needs right in my own neighborhood, my own community, in my own nation, halfway across the world in Nakuru, Kenya, what part am I being called to play in the miracle?